What I will speak about mostly will be results from research I did a couple of years ago when I focused more on agriculture and energy in my work. My recent focus has been more on forests, and so I will show you a little bit where that has led me, and if you're interested, I can also show you the backup slides that I prepared, which are more on forests and the connections between forest and agriculture. But I thought, since your interest is more on energy and agriculture, I'll show you some of the older things. And I hope that none of the colleagues here also took part in a seminar I attended several years ago in Santiago de Compostela. I showed some similar slides there, but I don't think I recognize any of the faces. So what I want to talk about today, briefly give a conceptual introduction of how long-term socio-ecological perspective views intensification and industrialization of land use and agriculture. And then I will show you some empirical results of the work I have done in the last years on first on these agro-ecosystem energy fluxes, that's the previous project's work. Then the more recent work I'm currently involved in, and it's not really finished, is on emissions from agriculture, where energy plays a role. So this is something new I can show you. And then I will end by showing you a periodization of land use in Austria. And this again draws on the energy work, but we will see how the emissions work will change maybe this periodization. And I will end with some conclusions of these findings. So how does social ecology view the interconnections between energy and land use during industrialization? Here, I like to use the concept of socio-ecological regime transitions that Fridolin Grausmann, my colleague here and previous PhD supervisor in Vienna, published on that. And in these very simplified images, you see on the left side the way energy flows are conceptualized in pre-industrial or agrarian regimes or societies, where land use essentially provides biomass and energy to both the agricultural and non-agricultural population. A large share of the population is agricultural, invests energy to the land to provide this energy. Yeah, and then biomass also fuels the non-agricultural population who invests work in the non-agricultural production, and also here biomass is the major fuel. Now this changes fundamentally with industrialization according to this scheme. So then fossil energy becomes available, and not only fuels sort of industrialized production, but also fuels land use, because there are fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, and tractors, machinery that is fueled with fossil energy. There is energy input to the agricultural population in terms of heating, cooking energy, and also to the non-agricultural population. And so less agricultural population, less labor, but much more biomass becomes available also, yes, due to these fuels. So that's a very sort of schematic idea of how industrialization changes the connections between energy provision and land use. And in a way, or a very simplified, the industrialization reduces the societal dependence on land for energy provision. Yeah, because the subterranean forests energy becomes available from fossil sources. Now, in the work that I currently do in the ERC project, I take this idea a bit farther, and we investigate here the effects of this socio-ecological regime transition on forest change. And there we argue that forest recovery, or the forest transition, so the observation that in many industrialized countries, forests expand and grow in terms of biomass, we investigate this process as a side effect of this socio-ecological regime transition. Yeah, and in this image, you see these gray arrows. They are emissions or carbon flows between atmosphere and the land. So forests, in the course of forest transitions, take up carbon, so they mitigate climate change. But we argue that there are processes connected to industrialization, connected to the use of fossil energy that enable this forest recovery and cause emissions outside of the forest sector. Yeah, so we would say the availability of fossil energy sources is what reduces the pressure on forests, and it enables forest recovery through the substitution of fuel wood, for example, through the use of coal, through the intensification of agriculture, where tractors are being used and mineral fertilizer, and through land displacement, so the cheaper international trade of large amounts of biomass. I'm of course aware that international trade of biomass products and seeds, as you are much more aware than me, was a process that happened long before industrialization, but the very strong increase in biomass trade also happened with industrialization. Yeah, and in that project, we look at the climate change mitigation effect of forest recovery and to which extent it is partly counteracted by emissions from these processes that enable forest transitions. Yeah, just so you know, that is my more recent focus has been more on forests and what happens in the forests and not so much on agriculture. And that's why I returned to some older work for this talk. Now I show this last conceptual slide on how we view energy fluxes through agroecosystems in Austria. This was research done in the SFS project, a large project involving also colleagues from Spain in Sevilla and Barcelona, and it was led by Jeff Canfer in Canada, where we investigated energy fluxes through agroecosystems in different contexts. And a very simplified representation of the energy flows we looked at different levels, national level, local level. And we investigated how much energy do societies invest into their agroecosystems. And here we look not only at agriculture, but also at the forest. So how much modern energy, so tractors, fertilizers, how much labor, how much biomass imports do they invest in the local or domestic agroecosystem to get out a certain amount of final products. And this is food, animal products for food, plant products for food, and also wood fuel. And then we also quantified how much biomass was recirculated within the agroecosystem. So how much feed did the livestock consume, how much litter did it consume, etc. And we converted all of these fluxes into energy. And then came up with different metrics for energy returns of investment. I will show you those in a little bit. So I will talk about Austria today, and I thought I'd show you a picture of Austria because people working in Portugal maybe not so familiar with the landscapes here in the east. So Austria is a very forest-dominated country, very hilly. More than 50% of the country is covered by the Alps, and mostly the Alps look not what we think of the high mountains, but more like this. So medium mountains. And in the long-term perspective, so we work a lot with historical statistics, agricultural censuses, etc., to reconstruct the distribution of land use, livestock numbers, and yields, etc. So here you see the reconstruction of land use in Austria based on agricultural statistics, and the major land use category since 1830 was forest. So more than 40% throughout this period was covered by forests in Austria. Now we are almost at 50% forest cover. Yeah, and typically this is on the hills. You see the forests. The second major land use category is grasslands. that's the not so high up hilly areas are covered by grasslands, and then in the higher Alps also the above the tree line. And cropland, and so grassland has decreased a little bit in area, so forests expanded over grasslands, and then croplands also decreased over time. So they are mostly in the plain areas, in the valleys. And then what we also reconstructed livestock numbers. These are of course much less robust data, the livestock censuses, but we do see a fairly consistent increase in livestock numbers throughout the 19th century, and a shift towards increasing pig numbers. And this shift after World War II increased even more. So the pigs continued to increase, whereas cattle sort of stabilized and then even declined. And we will see this decline in cattle since the mid-1980s has a very strong impact on energy flows in Austria, and also on emissions, by the way. So then now I turn to the energy flows that we reconstructed based on data on yields and biomass harvest, reconstructions of wood use, and reconstructions also of feed intake and the amount of biomass used in livestock production. And here you see that the very strong dominance of wood in Austrian biomass production. So we look at the final produce, so the amount of biomass that humans used out of their agroecosystems, and the whole period was dominated by wood extraction in terms of energy, and also the temporal trend was dominated by this. So this more than doubled over the time period, also due to dynamics in wood use. We also looked, I show you here a picture more on what happened in agriculture. It's maybe more important in your context. So here we also see an increase in the agricultural final products, in particular after World War II, a stronger increase. And the share of livestock products in total production slightly increased through the time period. Yeah, so from 4 to 7%. I mean, it's almost a relative doubling, but still in terms of total energy output, fairly low number. But we will see this makes a very big difference in terms of energy and emissions. Now, when we look at the input side of energy into the agroecosystem, again, always looking at agricultural land, livestock, and forests, we see a very strange curve. I look a lot at long time series, and this looks very strange to me to have this very steep sort of increase in a very short time and the stabilization before and after. But actually there are similar curves for Spain and France, where similar investigations have been performed. Yeah, and also maybe for you, it's not so surprising to see such a curve when you know the Green Revolution was such a big game changer also for energy in agriculture. So throughout the 19th century, there was a slight increase in energy input that is hardly visible here. It's well, the only energy input that we in our system boundaries quantified here was labor. So draft power is not explicitly included because it's considered as a sort of a reflux here. And then after the 1920s, the mineral fertilizers are added to this. And then after World War II, this steep increase, we see fertilizer use, we see the use of fuels in tractors, the use of electricity in milking machines, so a lot connected also to the livestock sector. And then also biomass imports we quantified here. And then strangely, there was a stagnation really after the 1980s, mostly because the embodied energy in our fertilizer use declined. So here a strong, significant efficiency increase in agriculture started. And we actually see that in many European countries, that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I think it was the European Nitrogen Directive that was even when Austria was not part of the European Union yet. And with that, the fertilizer inputs declined. The numbers, by the way, are fairly low, we will see later, compared to the output in terms of energy still. Now, we also, I told you, we quantified also the what we call biomass reused, this reflow of energy from the agroecosystem back into the agroecosystem. And mostly this was dominated by inputs into the livestock system. If you look at the categories here, yellow is fodder, gray is byproducts used for feed. So straw was used for feed in the 19th century more. Then hay and grazed biomass is the major material here, still used by the cattle mostly. Litter is used in the stable, so that's what is the bedding material for livestock, also quite a large energy flow. And then the biomass that is directly plowed into soils, like the straw that is returned, is actually a very small flow compared to the others. Yeah, and overall, this is a very large energy flow with a strange temporal dynamic following the livestock, the cattle numbers mostly, and the cattle sort of productivity also. And since the late 80s, we see a strong decline here again because of the declining cattle numbers. Yeah, and we did similar analysis at a bit more detail also at the local scale. I thought maybe it's interesting for you. We have a more local focus in your work. Here we worked with similar sources or statistical sources at the regional level in Upper Austria. You see here this small map where we have one lowland situation of more intensive agriculture and upland, more hilly, more similar to the region I showed you earlier. And we quantified these energy fluxes in the 1830, in the early 19th century, where you see these two regions look fairly similar, except if you look very closely, the output here, we have a bit more crops and here a bit more wood. So the upland region used more or extracted a higher fraction of wood and produced a lower fraction of crops. In the late 20th century, and I'm sorry, I forgot to exchange this. This should say 2000. Maybe if I can share the slides with you later, I can exchange that. Yeah. So these are the patterns of agroecosystem energy fluxes in 2000s in 2000 in that same region, in the same two regions, and you see how these energy flows really developed into very, very different directions. So in St. Florian, the lowland region, we see a very strong focus on crop production. And here also a lot of it is straw that is exported to other regions that can use the straw as input. Yeah, so this a lot has to do also with the system boundaries chosen. Whereas in the more upland system, where livestock is much more important, we see that, well, more energy goes into the livestock system, and then conversion is very inefficient, as always with livestock, and therefore this slightly higher fraction of livestock production changes the overall productivity of the agroecosystem. Interestingly, also here we looked at different time periods, 1830, 1950, and I think 1980 and 2000. And in 1950, the situation was not so different from 2000. Yeah, so the really big change happened in the second half of the 20th century. Now I'm already turning to the agricultural emissions in Austria. That's really ongoing work that mostly my colleagues Christian Lauck and Andreas Magerl are currently developing further. So here we applied IPCC methodology, so the accounting of greenhouse gases for agricultural activities, and used the historical data I showed you earlier on livestock, mostly livestock feed consumption, and the production of manure output, etc., to quantify agricultural emissions in the long time series. And here we see a slightly different dynamic. We see that over this time period, agricultural emissions grew by 50% roughly, with a strong decline again since the 1980s. And this again has very much to do with the changes in the livestock sector. Overall, the emissions are strongly dominated by methane emissions. So the orange part here is methane from enteric fermentation. So cattle digestion that releases these emissions. And so again, the trend is very much dominated by the cattle trends over the period. Yeah, and then we also in this we used a slightly different accounting logic than in the IPCC, where they look at agricultural emissions without considering emissions from fertilizer production or tractor use. We added those here to show their importance, and I thought for the energy interest it's useful to have them. And you actually see in terms of emissions, these are not very important processes. Yeah, we have here the blue is the machinery emissions from tractor use, and the green is the fertilizer production, so the emissions caused by the production of mostly nitrogen fertilizer. And overall in 2018, so here we extended also the time series, in 2018 these are 18% of the total emissions. Yeah, so a fairly, I would think, small number in terms of, in terms of value, but we see that this actually changed a lot the functioning of the system. Yes, and here, I mean, this is work that we are currently developing further. We want to investigate, we want to conduct a structural decomposition analysis to quantify what drove the changes in emissions. Was it the change in total production of agriculture? Was it the change in the composition of the production to the different products? Or was it the change in emissions intensity of production? So this is what we are at the moment developing, and then hopefully we will be able to identify specific periods in which specific drivers dominated. Yeah, but what we really can see, I mean, the agricultural production increased very strongly, as if you remember the first figure I showed you, even when emissions declined. Yeah, so we have a very strong efficiency increase here, more production and less emissions. And now I'm for the periodization, I return back to the energy work, where we tried to identify periods of agricultural change in terms of energy flows, and discerned three major periods according to energy returns on investment. And we here used three different metrics for energy return on investment. One, the energy return on labor inputs. So we ask, okay, how much final product is produced per unit of labor invested in the agroecosystem? That is the dark, the thick black line. The second indicator was the final produced per unit of biotic energy inputs. So here we added these reused biomass flows with the imported biomass. And so this is this thinner black line. And the third one is the energy return on modern energy input. So final produced per unit of industrialized energy input, if you will. So electricity, fossil energy in tractors, and energy embodied in mineral fertilizers. And that's this gray line here. And we see, so in the based on these indicators, we roughly tried to delineate different periods of intensification and industrialization in agroecosystems in Austria. And we found that in the first period, in the long 19th century, if you will, there was a decline in energy efficiency. So more additional labor was required to produce 1 additional unit of energy. Also in this period, if you remember, the harvest of wood went down, so there was a slight shift towards more agricultural products, also more livestock products, and this is what we see here. Yeah, both this energy return on labor slightly declined, the energy return on biotic inputs also declined slightly. Then after the First World War, and with the introduction of the Haber-Bosch process, mineral fertilizers first became available, then tractors were increasingly being used. So we have a new type of energy input, which grew more quickly than agricultural production or biomass production increased. So we have a strong decline in this energy return on modern energy input, and a slight decline in this energy return on biotic inputs. Also livestock increased in this period. That is the factor that mostly dominates this metric. And we see that the energy return on labor really increased, and it increased particularly with the introduction of tractors, not so much the fertilizers. And then since the 1980s, we actually see that all energy returns on investment increased again. Yeah, this is the period where the cattle numbers go down and the fertilizer goes down at the same time as more agricultural products are being produced. So we called that period a period of industrialized extensification and environmental awareness. Part of this process was also policy towards reducing the amount of livestock products being produced. There was a shift in the pricing of milk that aimed towards reducing the amount of cattle production. So in a way, it was an idea of purposefully extensifying agricultural production. Yeah, and we will see if we see similar, the same periods or slightly divergent periods when we look at the emissions trends and their drivers. Now I come to an end. The very general conclusions I draw from this at the moment is that the introduction of fossil energy-based technology made a very distinct qualitative change in agriculture and land use in Austria. And particularly since World War II, starting after World War I. Compared to the amount of biomass converted and the amount of emissions caused in the agricultural sector and the amount of fossil energy used, these fossil energy inputs actually remained fairly small in numbers. Yeah, I was surprised that the agricultural emissions by cattle are actually so large compared to this fossil energy input. So the change was really a qualitative more than quantitative in the case of Austria. And when we look both at emissions and also energy efficiencies, really the major lever for achieving more sustainability in agroecosystems appears to be to reduce the size of the livestock sector. Yeah, where we saw that already since the 1990s, a decrease in livestock production has strongly decreased the emissions, and also it contributed to higher efficiency. Of course, I'm aware livestock also is important for cultural landscapes, for biodiversity. So it's a very political topic, and I'm as you nod, so you may have similar experiences in Portugal. I'm also aware that livestock may be very important for biodiversity conservation in some extensive grazing systems, etc. So very much true. On the other hand, we see that it's it's really a big lever in comparison also to technological options for improving efficiency in agriculture, etc. So in that sense, I do make that statement just based on the data that we see here. Yeah, so that's something to discuss and explore, I think, where that could lead. So with this, well, thank you. I also want to acknowledge, of course, the contributions by all my colleagues that contributed to the paper and the ongoing work. And with this, I end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I thought, like in the beginning, that I was going also to show you something about Portugal, but I think I started. In the end, I didn't finish anything on Portugal, so I'm going to show you what I have worked during this. Since maybe 2014, what I have worked on the case of Denmark. And there are a lot of reasons why you come to study other country, except yours. And I think the reason why I started to think that Denmark would be an interesting case to study is because I studied the role of energy in Portugal and the role of energy for economic growth. And as you know, like Portugal doesn't have coal, and it had a sluggish growth. And I reached the conclusion that actually the lack of coal was very important to the development or the non-development of Portugal. And when I was presenting my PhD thesis, Jaime Reis asked, okay, but how about Denmark? Because Denmark is also a country that doesn't have, but that developed through agriculture. So why, how do you explain that? You know, that Denmark managed to develop and catch up with most of the rich economies by 1913, and then Portugal didn't. So I said, okay, and then I applied to this Salzburg Foundation to work with Paul Sharp, and I accepted and started to think, okay, what is the role of energy for Danish economic growth? So the three research questions which I have worked so far, and the first two are published and the last one is not, is that, okay, is the lack of domestic energy resources a limiting factor to growth or not? And if it's, what are the environmental consequences of Denmark's specialization, because they specialize through agriculture and through animal-based agriculture, and how Denmark adapts to lack of coal, to lack of access to coal during the First World War. So the first question, we started this research more or less in 2013 when I come to Denmark to research on this, and we answered this looking at Denmark, which was basically a country which has no domestic resources. It doesn't even have water. It was really like a country with almost no energy. It was like almost the most depleted country in the world. And we actually showed that Denmark's takeoff was really dependent on coal and really dependent on imported feed concentrates. So we kind of hint and show that actually domestic energy resources were not necessary if cheap imports were available, and that energy is also important if you are going to develop through agriculture. So we look to these hypotheses if fossil fuels are necessary or not for industrialization, and if it's important to have it inside your country, basically. We look to these two hypotheses. exactly because people were asking, okay, but Denmark followed this agriculture path. So maybe it is possible to follow this agriculture path to low energy intensive activities, because maybe agriculture is low energy intensive, and we show that it's not, definitely not the case for Denmark. It's very, very energy intensive. So we started just to construct accounts for Denmark for this period of from 1800 to 1913. You see here in the graph that we have like food for women and firewood and wind, water, oil, feed for working animals, just the usual way. I have calculated as well the energy consumption for Portugal. And you see actually that there is like this big increase already on coal consumption already since 1913. So for example, for Portugal, this figure, I don't know, I think coal consumption is 20% in 1913. So I mean, they are really late. You can see here actually the percentage of energy consumption that comes from coal in selected countries, and you can see, okay, England and Wales all over on the top, and Denmark is actually catching up really, really fast. You know, like it's like one of the countries that is the followers, and here you can see what I told you about Portugal. It's a laggard in coal consumption use. So, okay, this is very aggregate. So, but we start also to think that Denmark had like a very animal intensive type of agriculture. So that used a lot of feed for working animals. So then we thought like, okay, why don't we include the feed that is used to produce the livestock products? And Denmark is known for producing butter and for producing bacon and producing eggs to the English market. That's how they develop. We started to experiment and just calculated, okay, we were just interested in the dairy sector at this point, and we just calculated how much feed the cows and oxen, which were then going to provide the milk that was going to be butter, how much feed were they consuming, which was actually part of, you can consider that it's part of the energy system because Denmark developed through this agriculture. So you can consider that it's like an input for the production. And then you see here that if you consider, besides the feed for draught animals, which are important for mechanical drive, if you actually include the feed for cows and oxen, and then suddenly you have a very, very, very energy intensive Denmark, right? This orange part and this black part are very intensive way of industrializing their agriculture. And and then we started to look, okay, a little bit more about their development story. I told you that they are basically an export market to the UK. They produce breakfast foods for the UK, and with that they converge really fast with the UK and leading economies. And what is the technology that they use to produce butter? They actually use this automatic cream separator. And they are also known in the usual stories, this automatic cream separator, this adoption of technology, and these institutions. So they did these cooperative dairies where they joined together so that they can avoid being so small. So they join together so that they can export. And but if you think about the automatic cream separator, that's like totally run on coal. And this is like a kind of a dairy factory in the 1900s with the cow, and you see this dairy factory is like the place where they receive milk from the producers, and then it's separated in cream separator. The milk is separated. A part is skim milk, and the other part is going to be butter, right? Like the fat. And this is totally based on coal. And this kind, and this is the reason why the cooperatives appeared, was like to buy this kind of to buy this kind of machines, so that they will have like money to do that. So what is these cooperatives? You can see, like in 1883, there is almost no cooperatives that use like these separators. They started here, and then here we have 1884. They appear as well in island of Holland and in New Zealand. 1886, 1888, and you see they are just really spread all over the country. Like, so it's like more than 1,000 cooperatives just using like this technology, and just in the space like of 10 years. So it's like really based. So in the rest of the paper, we are like doing a lot of things just to account for the role of energy in the agriculture, and especially on dairies. And this is an example that we do. We have like the butter production, and knowing the kilograms that you need to make like butter, and knowing like the feed that you need to give the cows so that they can produce milk, we arrived like a conclusion that it was actually maybe 20% of the energy consumption was just for the dairy sector of Denmark, if you include feed for cows, which is just a very important input action. So why Denmark managed to do this? Basically, this fits with the story that we know. Basically, it adopted free trade during the first year of globalization. So while countries like Portugal and others were protectionist, they just imported this cheap grain that they from the US that they fed the animals. And on the other hand, they also basically just imported coal from the UK. And while this was really restrictive to most of the countries, so coal didn't arrive so expensive to Lisbon, but then the problem was that it just stayed in Lisbon because we had like lots of problems with internal transportation, and that and then the coal price will be really, really, really high. What will happen in Denmark is that they are basically 50. Nowhere is more than 52 kilometers from the coast, so they enjoy really like a nice kind of geography. So they have both cheap rain. They manage cheap rain and cheap coal, and that's how they kind of managed to industrialize. Here you can see the coal prices are much lower even at the ports than in other countries, being the problem with Portugal, the internal transportation that Denmark didn't have. So yeah, so for the first research question, we arrived at this conclusion that yes, coal was very necessary, and if it's important to have it in your country, or if the location is important, yes, the location is important, but of course what is important is the economic, not the geographical distance. So this is my first paper. The second paper, it's the same time period. We are looking for the environmental consequences of this specialization in animal intensive agriculture. So this is actually a paper in a special issue that Simone edited. So I'm sorry if you are going to see a little bit about this work. But one thing that we are interested in was that what are the impacts of the environmental impacts of specialization on trade, and especially what their the impacts on energy consumption. So we look both at the imports from Denmark from the UK, and we look also for the exports of Denmark for the UK, and we look to see how much energy is hidden on the imports and exports, on the trade that Denmark and UK does. And that's kind of interesting, because this period of 1870 to 1913 is really like a period of big specialization. So UK, Germany, and US have, like, in 1870, 80% of the world's gold and 75% of all the pig iron and steel. But on the other hand, we also have this massive inflow to industrialized European markets. So like this hidden energy in the products of lands, like the grain and meat. So it's kind of interesting to see just how these flows were coming. And so this study calculates embodied energy in the trade between Denmark and UK during this period. And we actually show that ignoring the energy that is really hidden in agriculture exports can be really misleading. So, because as you probably noticed from the last paper, it's actually quite a lot. So this is like kind of just a summary of comparison between the UK and Denmark, and you can see that Denmark has actually GDP, and they are really like well fed. So this is like two really wealthy countries, but they are, as you can imagine, they are totally different in terms of their specialization. One specializes in agriculture and the other in industry, right? So here we can see the Danish exports to the UK. They had like a large, how do you say, surplus in the trade. So it was actually from 3 million pounds to 24 million pounds in 1913, while Denmark imports from the UK were much less, right? So from 2 million in 1870 and 6 million in 1930. And you can see what basically Denmark exports to the UK. And this is exactly what I say. It's like bacon, it's butter, it's eggs. And Denmark, what does it import from the UK? It's basically coal, iron, textiles, and like so division of labor. So for this paper, we kind of developed a new method where we calculate this embodied energy, which will be equal to this exported energy, which is basically the energy that you can account on food or on fossil fuels that you can account. So like if I import like a milk, I know how many calories it has, but then all the hidden energy that is necessary to do like these products, then that you don't really know. So that's what I did. Like so we calculated this hidden energy embodied in this products. using like this process analysis where we can we are trying to figure how much energy goes into a ton of product. So for example, here for an industrial product, you will see that you need coal. That's a direct energy requirement, but you also need to mine the coal. So that's like an indirect energy requirement. You need pulp, but you also need energy to do the pulp for doing the paper, and you also need to mine to mine that coal to do the paper. So you try to account for this kind of fossil fuels, and you do the same for the English breakfast. So you try to account for the flows that are on butter, bacon, and pork and eggs, and that includes grass, it includes grain, it includes concentrates, but it also includes like fertilizers and yeah, just energy in general for agriculture. So it's a lot of things to consider, and that was so for you to understand our concept, our conceptual. That's what we kind of try to do. So in this black, you see the hidden energy, so the energy that you don't see, and here the exported energy is the energy that you actually see, that you can actually consume, and that's equal to this embodied energy. And as you see, this was like a long process. We need to know like how the land of Denmark was distributed, how much was going for grain and grass and root crops, how much oil crops were used, oil cakes were used, and then we went to the US statistics to see how much energy they used to produce their oil cakes, for example. Or we went to these Chilean statistics of fertilizers to know how much coal they were using to produce the Chilean nitrates. So that's the kind of really difficult calculations, I think, or very long calculations that we have done, and I learned a lot. We learned a lot in industrial processes in this, and we arrived to these embodied energy intensities of the most traded goods. And here, like in blue and orange, you can see the UK, and here you can also see in yellow and gray, you can see the energy intensities of the breakfast products. You can see they are actually more intense in general than the products that the UK imports to Britain. So these were the results for 1870. Of course, energy in trade. So Denmark has a really so UK exports a lot of energy in trade because it exports a lot of coal. It exports much more than Denmark exports on food in 1870. And in 1870, the UK also exported more hidden energy in trade. So 10, while Denmark only 4.4. So there was this big deficit. In 1913, what happens? It happens that the UK continues to export a lot of coal to Denmark, and Denmark not so much food, it's fixed. But if you look to hidden energy in trade, then you can see like that Denmark actually exports much more hidden energy in trade to the UK, 54, than the UK exports to Denmark, 17. So while coal is really dominant, you can see really that the energy that is in the products actually is more energy intensive in Denmark if you don't account for the coal. No, basically that's it. But of course, coal is very important. So in the paper, we did like a kind of decomposition of embodied energy in the bacon, butter, and products. And we actually saw that only like 2/3 of the energy that Denmark exported to the UK were consumed in Denmark. So that means that 1/3 come from somewhere else, right? Not from Denmark land. So that is the conclusion, that Denmark had a lot of land-based exports, and that it's really like a paradox, because for one hand they specialize in this animal-based agriculture, but yet they try to escape the land constraints. And how did they do that? They basically imported, right? Imported from somewhere else. They imported fertilizers. They imported grain. They imported oil cakes. They were the first country basically to do that, like to import feed from abroad to give to their animals, so that they can save land. So basically, agricultural land didn't change in Denmark from 1870, 1913, but their productivity didn't kept enough with the demand from the UK. So they just found some way, some other place to actually find the inputs for their livestock production. So these developments overcome the problem of land scarcity in an agriculture economy. So I'm not sure how much time I have used. Can you?
Yeah, more 10 minutes, it's fine.
Okay,
it's okay.
So then, okay, because this is my, how do you say, my newest research. Yes, which I am not like the main author. This is our it's joint work with Paul Sharp, Chanti Tsukli, and Christian Vedel, and it's the one that is not published. It's just published as a working paper. And it's called Resilience, Adaptability, and Transformability, Danish Butter Factories in the Face of Food Shortages. So we have seen that I have argued in the last two papers that Denmark is Denmark development is very based on coal, and it's very based on feed. So this energy is very important. So that's what I have argued in the last two papers. But so we wanted to actually check what happened to Denmark, what would happen to the dairies if they were cut from all access to coal, right? And the idea is that actually the First World War could serve as a natural experiment, because coal from the UK was actually more or less cut off. And unlike Italy or Austria, maybe that you have either forests or you have hydropower, like Denmark didn't have much things. Basically, you saw that all the land is devoted to feeding the animals, right? But we wanted to see if it was really important for the development, or if butter factories could actually adapt or not. And we focus mainly on then two sides of the literature. One we have seen, which is that coal are very important for industrialization. But another one is like from another current is more from energy economics, that in face of insecurity in the energy systems, adaptability matters. So it matters resilience to the shocking system. You need to adapt on the other hand, and in the end, you might want to transform your energy system so it's like more secured against like external shocks. And this means, for example, diversifying. So, okay, our contribution is actually to find what happens when coal is suddenly missing, and through this micro level exogenous identification. So it's basically trying to find some causality. And we find actually that our alternative fuel sources were advantages, and that this is kind of a relevant historical case because it shows some adaptability. So this is how Denmark looks now in 1900 to 1935 in terms of dependence of coal. I'm here not including the feed now, because what is relevant is like the dairy sector, and you see that it's really very dependent, right? But something happens here in the World War period where they go to peat. Please, a little bit of peat is used, and then it goes away. So, as a lot of countries, as it happened to a lot of countries, including Portugal, basically imports of coal ceased from the UK, and prices spiked, and prices spiked during the war and also after the war, because after the war there was strikes, there was the Spanish flu, there was a lot of things going on. So basically we have like this period of really high coal prices and limited supplies, and for countries like Denmark, that's like really horrible, right? So what are we doing to assess like this data? We are going to use these Dansk Mighty drift statistics, and I'm going to show what it is. It's like this is like the cooperatives, right? So it's like some industrial statistics for each individual cooperative that has micro level data, and it has micro level data to really a lot of things. So you can do so many papers with these micro level things, because it says how much milk it enters, how many products they are choosing, if they have fire insurance, how many cows are being used. It also says which kind of wool they are using, for example. And in 1914, they were using, for example, just coal. Everybody was using coal. There was nothing. This is from 1914. In 1917, okay, you maybe don't understand Danish, but it says something here. Vilket brensel, what fuel are you using? And this K, B, T, and things like that. It's already like, okay, we are using coal, we are using firewood, and we are using peat. So most of them are using this KBT. They are using everything, okay? They are using a lot of things. So what are we going to do? We are going to use this kind of data from cooperative to cooperative. And we are going to assess how their milk butter ratio changes due to this big shock, okay? So if you have in mind, cooperative farms milk their cows, right? It goes to the separated, and you can either use coal, which is up, right? This black thing, that's like First World War, basically. Or you can use peat, which is like down here, to produce butter, right? And this milk to butter ratio can change due to the efficiency of the machine. And how it can change, basically it will change because if it doesn't have like so much coal to run, right? Like factories that don't have so much coal, so much fuel to have, they have to stop the machine. So the machine has to stop, and then it's not so efficient. So that's how it kind of works. So we try to do this model, which is differences in differences, and we are going to see, okay, what happens to factories that are using or more likely to use coal, peat or not, and if the alternative is a benefit or not. So for that, we need like to have like this exogenous variable. So we are going to measure the distance to potential peat sources from the dairies. So in green here, what you can see is that if the soil is adequate or not to grow peat. So it's like a map that is exogenous. That doesn't mean if the factories are using or not using peat, but you can actually code the cooperatives, and you can code their geography, and you can see if they are at low distance from this type of soils, if they are at medium distance from this type of soils, and if they are at high distance, and if the distance means something to the milk productivity or not. And okay, so I'm going past really quickly, but what is really important in this model is that this is negative, and this is good because it means that if you are more close to peat, you are going to use to have a much higher probability of having like a higher butter to milk ratio. Okay, so that means that you are much more productive. Okay, so factories that were close to peat were much more productive, and then you can see this group one is, you know, in these years is more productive, is actually more productive also after the 1920s, when most of the price problems ended. While the group 3, which is more far away, is like inversely less productive. So what are our conclusions is that creameries that are closer to areas with this soil type are more productive. So Danish creameries prove actually able to adapt to this very difficult situation. But on the other hand, this is not the only part of the story, because while in the first paper you see that we don't have issues with, Denmark doesn't have issues with local supply because it is like economically close. During the war, this is actually the opposite. So there are location problems, so which were not an issue before. And it's interesting that they were able to adapt and maintain a productivity lead until the late 20s. But we can also not speak about, we can speak about adaptability, but we cannot speak about transformability of the system. So they didn't switch, for example, to electricity cream separators as they did it in Austria. So it wasn't, they were not able to provide a long-term energy diversification strategy. Okay, so I finished my 3 papers. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.